talking to all of you. As Asians, especially living in this part of Asia, we cannot live without rice. It seems that it is impossible for us to survive without eating rice. And so every day, somehow we have to cook rice, right? Any one of you who do not eat rice? So we have a few special cases. Okay. But normally we cook rice every day, and perhaps right now we would use what we call a rice cooker. And normally we just leave the rice there and it will cook after several minutes. But probably 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when the rice cooker was not yet very popular, we still use the old conventional way of cooking rice. You would put the rice in a pot, measure the water using our finger. Remember that? Make sure that the water is about this deep, and then let it remain for a few minutes, and trust that it will cook by itself. Now, when I was still small, I remember my mother would tell me, when the rice is cooking, never open the lid. Do not keep on opening the lid. And of course, she said that if you keep on opening the lid, the rice will not cook evenly, right? And sometimes, as kids, we cannot wait to see how the rice is being cooked. Is it ready yet? Because during that time, whenever I would open the lid of the rice pot, it means I'm already, ready for lunch or for dinner. If we cannot wait until the right time, sometimes things may not necessarily go very well. It is true when we are talking about cooking rice, and it is also true sometimes when we're talking about our life experiences. It is very important for us to wait for the right time. It's very important for us to wait for God's time, for things to go the way God wants it to be, and for us to experience the full blessing of the Lord. Let me read again. Let me read to you a verse in Genesis chapter 21, verse 2. It says, "So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God has spoken to him." There are two things I think that is very important for us to take note in this verse. First of all, when God fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah, He fulfilled it according to His promise to him, to Abraham. Things happen according to the word which God has spoken to Abraham and Sarah. The promise was fulfilled according to God's purpose. And secondly, it was fulfilled at the appointed time. So there are two things I think that is very important for us to remember. First, it must happen according to God's promise. Second, it must happen according to God's time. Let me ask you a question. Have you been praying for something? Have you been waiting for God to do something for you? Perhaps this is a very important lesson for us to bring home. In fact, I have already shared to you the main point of my message for today. God's appointed time and God's promise. In fact, I can already go down and sit because you have already heard what I wanted to say. But please don't leave yet. There are still some other important lessons that we can learn from the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. The story that we would be reading today shows the importance of submitting to God's plan, and that includes submitting to His timing as well, and the consequences of not waiting for God's time. You see, Abraham was first introduced in Genesis chapter 11 and chapter 12, where God made a promise to him that He will build a great nation out of his descendants. And this promise was also repeated in Genesis chapter 15. When God said to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the skies. Now, if God promised Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars, will be thousands upon thousands, you know, there's a Chinese saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with what? With one step, right? And I think if we are going to look at it from God's promise to Abraham, the journey towards having multitude of descendants begins with what? One child, right? And at that time, Abraham and Sarah was still waiting for God to fulfill their promise to them. Now, one of the difficulties that they are going through at that time is that Abraham and Sarah was already advanced in years. Therefore, if you're looking at it from a human standpoint, it seems that it is already impossible for them to have children. Now, of course, we may have heard of news about people who are already advanced in years and still having children. Several years ago, you may have heard of this lady. Her name is Rajo Devi Lohan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. But she was already 70 years old when she had a son in 2008. And if you have heard of her story, she bore a son, not through natural means, but she underwent what we call the IVF, for sure. You know what I'm talking about, the IVF. Even though she was able to bear a son at age 70, it was not natural also. Somehow there's the help of science, and that's why she was able to bear a son. And there are several other cases that is similar to her case. But in the case of Sarah and Abraham, I don't think they would be able to go to a doctor and say, we want to have this IVF. Of course, the moral and ethical issues related to that, we would not be talking about that. But at least we see that in the case of Abraham and Sarah, somehow they don't have that privilege or luxury to be able to enjoy that. And they have to wait upon the Lord. Several years had passed, and we know that God had not yet fulfilled His promise to them. And it seems that Abraham and Sarah was already, becoming very impatient for waiting. And that is why Sarah at one point began to decide, maybe it's time for us to help God. Let me ask you another question, brothers and sisters. Have you been waiting for something from the Lord? Have you been waiting for something from the Lord? Are you being impatient already? The lesson that we can learn here is for us to wait and to trust that the Lord is doing something. God made a promise in Genesis chapter 12. 10 years have gone by, and we reached Genesis chapter 16. They did not yet receive the promise. And so Sarah was beginning to be impatient, and so she said, so Sarah said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 16 verse 2, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abraham listened to her voice. Sarah was already impatient. And she was not only impatient, but somehow she began to look at things from her perspective and said, you know what? God is doing something, and the thing that He's doing right now is that He's the one who is preventing this thing to happen. Now, if Sarah said it is God who is preventing her from receiving the promise, it seems that it's another way of saying, you know what? God made us a promise, but it seems that He's becoming our enemy right now. He made a promise, 10 years have passed, He would not fulfill His promise. It is as if God would make a promise that He's not able to fulfill, or He's not willing to fulfill. Let me ask you another question. For those of us who waiting for God to do something? Are you tempted to think that, you know what, if God can do something and He refused to do it, maybe God is not working on my side. Maybe He's doing something against me. Maybe He's doing something that is, you know what, not advantageous to me. And sometimes it is very tempting for us to think that way, especially if things are not going the way we expect it to. Just like what happened to Sarah. She said, God is the one preventing me from having children. And now she begins to consider God as her enemy. Aside from that, she did not only consider God as her enemy. Look at the next verse, in verse 5. She said, and Sarah said to Abraham, may the wrong done to me be upon you. And this was after she learned that Hagar was pregnant, and that Hagar began to belittle her. And she said to Abraham, may the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. When things do not go our way, what is the temptation that we face? The temptation is that we would think, first of all, God is our enemy. He's not working for us. And secondly, the people around us are also our enemies. And they are not helping us, working for us. Have you been through that kind of temptation? To think that God is your enemy, or the people around you are your enemies also? See, this is one of the things that natural tendency of humans. If things do not go our way, we look for people to blame. And I think this is something that we need to bring to the Lord if we are tempted to think this way. This was Sarah's assessment. It is God who prevented her, and also the people around her are considered her enemies. That's why she said, may the wrong done to me be upon you. That's what she said to her husband. Not only what was she thinking, the maid was despising me, but you, my husband, is not doing something about it. And therefore, what? Abraham, you are also my enemy. If you are on my side, then do something about it. Do something about it. If you're not going to do something about it, then you're also my enemy. Are we tempted to think that way? Let's continue on reading, and perhaps we can learn something from this story. The story continues on. In verses 11 and 13, we read about Hagar after she was driven out by Sarah. She was driven out by Sarah, and then she for the first time, Hagar for the first time met the Lord. And it was said here in verse 11 and 13, it says, behold, you are with a child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord had given heed to your affliction. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God who sees. Now, the story is shifted from Sarah to Hagar. After Sarah was despised by Hagar, Hagar had to leave her masters. And then after a while, she was already suffering and away from her master. It was then, at that time, for the first time, she met the Lord. And the Lord revealed Himself to her and gave her this promise. And she said, and I said to her, you are with a child, and you shall call his name Ishmael. Interestingly, the name Ishmael means the Lord hears. And I think this is one of those assurances that God is giving us, that sometimes it would be during the lowest times of our life that we can be assured that we have a God who hears. For God to say to Hagar, name your son Ishmael, is a way for God to to tell Hagar, you must have something for you to remember that the Lord hears your prayers. In fact, name your child Ishmael. How do you think Hagar would feel every time she would call her son? For example, her son would go out to play and she would call her son, Ishmael, come. It's time to go to bed. Every time she would call the name Ishmael, that would be a constant reminder for her that, yeah, I have a God who hears. The Lord hears my prayer. In fact, my son is named Ishmael. And not only that, Hagar learned something else about God. God is not only someone who hears our prayers, but God, the Lord, is also the God who sees. Let's go back to the verse again, where it says, behold, you are with a child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Then she called the name of the Lord what? You are the God who sees. You are the God who sees. Not only was she assured that she has a God who hears, but she was also reminded that she has a God who sees. You know, in Genesis chapter 22, we read about Abraham's encounter with the Lord when the Lord asked Abraham to offer his son Isaac. And when the Lord provided for him a sacrifice in place of his son Isaac, remember what the name that Abraham gave to the Lord. Abraham called God Yahweh Yireh, or sometimes we pronounce it Jehovah Jireh. Anyone knows what that means? I'm sure you've heard it many times. Oh, Jehovah Jireh. It means the Lord provides. But here's a trivia. Do you know that Jehovah Jireh actually means the Lord hears? It is that the Lord sees. It is because the Lord sees the faith of Abraham, and the Lord sees the condition of Abraham. The Lord sees that Abraham was already suffering at that time when he was about to offer his son, and because the Lord sees, the Lord also saw him through. That's why He provided something for him to offer in place of his son. Even before Abraham discovered that the Lord is the God who sees, Hagar already discovered that. In fact, she named a place also, Beer Lahai Roi, because she said, I have a God who sees me. And brothers and sisters, I think this is a very good assurance for us. If you are going through difficulties, if you are waiting for God to hear your prayers, if you are waiting for God to do something for you, sometimes the most difficult thing for us to do, for humans to do, is to wait. Isn't it true? If we're waiting for something, if you're praying for something, and years have passed, and it seems that the Lord had not heard our prayers yet, somehow we are getting impatient. I think it's very important for us to be reminded, you know what? We have a God who hears, and we have a God who sees. And therefore we can continue to wait for Him. Moving on, as we look at Genesis chapter 21, we see how the Lord fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah. And we read in verses 1 and 2. It says, then the Lord took note of Sarah, as He had said. The Lord did for Sarah as He had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time which God had spoken to him. You see, when Sarah said in chapter 16 that it was the Lord who prevented her from having a child, partially it was true. Because it was the Lord who gave the promise, and it was the Lord who delayed a little bit, because He was waiting for the appointed time for Him to fulfill the promise. But at that time, Sarah was thinking, you know what? God is taking so long. Because he's taking so long, he seems to be not working on my favor, and therefore, you know what, he's not on my side. In fact, the people around me are not also on my side. Therefore, she considered them as their enemies. But from the story of Hagar, we learn that God is not someone who gives promise and who would not fulfill it. He's just waiting for the right time. In fact, He's the God who hears and He's the God who sees. That's why when we get to Genesis chapter 21, the author of Genesis now clearly tells us that God, after the time period when God had waited to fulfill His promise, He indeed fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah. The Lord took note of Sarah. Take note of that statement. The Lord took note of Sarah. The Lord sees again the condition of Sarah, and then He decided, now it's time to fulfill my promise to them. The Lord took note of Sarah, and as He said, and the Lord did for Sarah as He promised. You see, if God promised something, we are sure that He will fulfill. Even if He delays a little bit, I think we can wait for Him. Don't you think so? See, sometimes when we say, if I have to wait for 1 year, that may be too long. But sometimes, for the Lord, 1 year may not be too long. Sometimes we are thinking, 2 years may be too long. But perhaps for the Lord, 2 years is just the right time. The most important thing is that we are assured that we have a God who hears and that we have a God who sees. In fact, as we continue on reading chapter 21, we see here in verse 17, it says, God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. This was a time when Sarah and Abraham had decided that, it's time for Hagar to leave them permanently. And at that time, Hagar was already suffering tremendously, because she was at that point when she doesn't know what to do anymore with her son. Once again, during the lowest point of her life, she was assured that she has a God who hears her cries. The Lord said to her, God heard the lad crying, and the angel of the Lord called Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, because God has heard the voice of the lad. We have a God who hears, and we have a God who sees. Now you may be wondering, why is it that we keep on jumping from one character to another? At first we begin with Sarah, and then we move to Hagar, and then we move to Sarah again, and then we move to Hagar again. Whose story is this really? Have you ever wondered whose story is this? Initially, we are talking about Sarah, and then we talk about Hagar, and then we talk about Sarah once again, and then we talk about Hagar. You see, we have to understand also that even though there are many characters in the Bible, but there's one main character in the story, and that main character is the Lord, because the Lord is the one orchestrating. He's the one who gives the promise. He's the one who fulfills His promise. He's the one who hears the voice of His people, and He's the one who sees the condition of His people, and He's working in order to fulfill His promises to us. In Genesis chapter 12, it is God who gave the promise. And I think because it is the Lord who gave the promise, He's waiting for a response from us. And that is for us to believe. Genesis chapter 16, we see the Lord working. And our responsibility is to wait. Genesis chapter 21, we see the Lord fulfilling His promise. And I think if the Lord fulfills His promise to us, the only correct response from us is to give thanks to Him. But the most important thing is for us to remember that through all these things, as God promised, as God works, as God fulfills, we can be assured that we are worshiping a God who hears and a God who sees us. Why don't we pray? Lord, we want to thank you and we want to give you praise, because you are the God who sees and you are the God who hears. Lord, thank you for the story that we can, the story from Genesis, where we can learn valuable lessons from you. And thank you for that assurance that it is you who is at work, and you're the ones who is making things, fulfilling things at the right time. And we want to praise you for hearing our prayer. We wanted to praise you for seeing our condition, for seeing everything that we are going through. And if there are some people here who have been praying for something, waiting for you to fulfill it, I pray that you would grant them whatever they are asking for, if it is according to your will. And I pray that through all these things, may your name be glorified, may your name be praised. And we commit them into your hands. In Jesus' name we pray.